So what we're gonna be doing here is PAILs and rails, positional isometric contractions. That stands for progressive and regressive angular isometric load. All we're doing here is passive stretching, and then we're isometrically contracting in the stretched position. We're gonna be focusing on internal rotation of our hip. We have a handful of setups that we can do to expand how much range of motion we have for internal rotation. And for today, we're gonna be doing internal rotation and abduction of the hip. We have a lot of variability in how we can go ahead and get the most out of this drill, but what matters the most is understanding the height of your pelvis relative to the table you're at. So if I'm elevating my foot like this, depending on how tall I am and how well my pelvis can rotate relative to my femur, that will dictate what's actually doing the stretch. So the focus here is to keep our femur completely still and rotate our pelvis around it. So when we're doing this drill, I don't want to see excessive spine rotation. I want to see pelvic rotation, and I want to breathe into the stretch and try to feel what would almost feel like bone stretching. It's not going to feel like muscle stretching. If we have a hard time finding the stretch, we may need to stand on a jump box of some kind, or a platform, a step box, to elevate ourselves, or we need to have a lower platform to put our leg on so that the relation between where our knee is at and our hip can give us the best stretch that we can find. So again, all I'm looking for is for my pelvis to rotate. You'll see that my femur here hasn't moved at all, and I'm rotating my pelvis until I feel my deep hip capsule stretching. So we're gonna go ahead and set ourselves for a timer for about 2 minutes and focus on diaphragm breathing, where I'm inhaling through the nose and exhaling through my mouth. And as I relax, I'm trying to get a little bit more pelvic rotation. The pole here is just for support, so I don't lose my balance. If balance is my limiting factor here, it's gonna be very difficult for me to maintain the end range of motion of the stretch. If you get pinching at any point during this drill, we need to readjust and try to find a stretch rather than a pinch sensation. And how that might work is lowering the height that our leg is at, or elevating how high we're standing so that we're not so deep into range of motion that we actually can't manage. About a minute of stretching. The intensity of the stretch may dictate whether we need to passive stretch or not. Internal rotation for me is still a weak point, so spending time in a passive stretch is worth it for me. It's worthwhile for me because of how much of a stretch I'm getting. If you're somebody who tinkers with the stretch enough and you still can't find it no matter what, then we may not need to work on passive range of motion, and doing isometrics would be the next thing that we go into, which we're gonna go into in a moment. So we're at the 2-minute mark. So it's really important to understand what exactly we're trying to do here. With my pelvis rotated, I need to ensure that I don't come out of the end range. So as soon as I begin contracting and tensing tissue in my hip, I'm gonna feel my pelvis wanting to shift out of the end range, and that's because it's the hardest position to be in and an area that my body isn't comfortable in. So I'm gonna maintain this end range, and I'm gonna begin my PAILs contraction, my progressive angular isometric load. So I'm driving my foot down, and I'm contracting my hip in the stretched position without letting my pelvis rotate out of the end range. I'm holding onto the pole for support. I'm driving my ankle down as if I'm externally rotating my thigh, my femur, my upper thigh bone. And I'm gonna sit here for about a minute or so and just let this burn. The intensity at which we do the contraction at is very circumstantial. It depends on what we're trying to achieve here. But a good rule of thumb would be to do about a minute of a PAIL where you're pushing down, 45 seconds of moderate tension, and then the last 15 seconds we're gonna go 100%. I'm still making sure I'm not coming out of the end range, and we have 30 seconds left. I'm gonna start dialing it up slowly. We're at the 45-second mark, and I'm going to give it 100% effort in 3, 2, 1. And relax. So that was my PAIL. Again, my progressive angular isometric load. I'm basically contracting tissue in my hip in the stretched position. And now we're gonna begin the rails contraction, the reverse, the regressive angular isometric load. So again, without letting my pelvis shift out of the end range, I'm gonna try to internally rotate my femur, my thigh, and lift the foot up and try to contract my hip on the regressive tissue. You'll see that my foot isn't actually coming up, and that's the point. It's tissue training, not movement training. If all I did was focus on trying to lift my leg up like this, I wasn't actually at the end range of motion, and I lost sight of the goal. The objective here is to be at the end range of motion with my pelvis fully rotated and my femur at the very same position at the end range. And I'm trying to contract my hip and try to internally rotate further, and my foot does not need to come up. I'm gonna be sitting here for another 30 seconds or so and just trying to rail and squeeze my hip as hard as I can, with the objective being trying to lift the foot up. That is the only goal of this. And then we would relax. If we get out of this, it's gonna feel like that leg basically died. And that means we got pretty much everything we could out of this setup. Some good practice would be to do some general cars and just get some good movement to our hip. As a way to just keep things moving and reduce any stiffness that we have following that set. My hip usually feels a lot better after doing some cars following some really high intensity isometrics. We're gonna go ahead and do our other leg now. We're gonna basically skip our passive stretch simply because I don't need passive space on my right hip. So when I go ahead and I do the stretch for internal rotation and abduction in this setup, the stretch sensation to me, and I'm just making a judgment call on this, is not worthwhile. It's not a good use of my time. It's not a good use of my resources either. So we're gonna go ahead and just find our passive stretch. I'm rotating my pelvis relative to my femur. I found my passive stretch. Because it's not a good use of my time, I'm not gonna do this any longer, and I'm gonna immediately go into my isometric contractions. So I begin paling, driving my foot down, trying to externally rotate my hip. You can see we're irradiating as much tension as we can. I'm reducing movement at the spine by bracing my core. I'm making sure my pelvis is not coming out of the end range. Got another 30 seconds left, 10 seconds until we go 100% effort. 3, 2, 1, 100% effort as hard as we can while maintaining our position. And then the reverse, the rail without moving my pelvis. Trying to lift my foot up and internally rotate. Feeling my hip wanting to cramp and still pushing through it. For another 20 seconds or so. Just like the other side, doing some global cars in an effort just to get as much movement as we can to our hip.